and we will turn it over to Beth.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with all of you tonight. I cannot believe the number of people we have here from all over the world. We found out earlier we even have someone from Australia. So welcome, everybody, near and far. I have a lot to share with you tonight. So please, get comfy, grab something to drink, a notepad, and settle in to do some learning with us. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you, Deborah, for having me. And thank you to all the participants who've shown up tonight. We're going to be talking about ambiguous loss. And this is a type of loss that most of us are experiencing right now alongside of our children because of the pandemic. A few reminders before we get started is to, if you haven't already, add your email and either say newsletter if you'd like to stay in contact with me and receive updates on events and different children's mental health topics and skills, and put in their mailing list if you'd like to be on Deborah's mailing list. And these are all email lists, not hard copies. Also, if you don't want to be included on the recording, I ask you that you please turn off your recording. And also make sure you're on mute before we get started. And also at the end, there will be a question and answer session. So please, if you can, stay on towards the end. If the recording works out well, I will be sending the recording out afterwards, but it might take me a couple of days to get it downloaded and all technology situated. That is not my strength. I'm more of a people person. So yeah, so I'm really happy to be here with all of you and shed some light on what ambiguous loss is and what we can do to help children who are living with it. I'm going to share my screen now so you can see my presentation. One second while I just get situated here. Okay, can everybody see that? Yeah, okay, see some heads nodding. Okay, so we'll get started. My cursor works. Okay, there we go. A little disclaimer that this is not professional mental health advice, and to please seek a licensed mental health professional if you're struggling with any of these issues, and that this is just for educational purposes only. Please keep that in mind as we're going through. So tonight we'll go through an introduction, then what is ambiguous loss? Why does it matter? What are the symptoms? And how to help children cope, and then some conclusions and resources. I would like to share a little bit about me. Thank you, Deborah, for that amazing introduction that you gave me, but I also would like to share a little bit more about who I am and beyond just, all the, the titles and the different things I've been involved with. So I was a psychotherapist within the child welfare system, and I worked with kinship, adoptive, and foster families, helping them cope with all the incredible loss and trauma that they've experienced. While I was doing that work, I was really inspired to write a children's book, but I just didn't have the time because I was, so in it that I didn't have time to stop and do something creative like that. But I always said one day I'm going to write a children's book for grandparents and grandchildren. And I did that about 2 years ago. It was maybe, yeah, about 2 years ago. And it's called A Grand Family for Sullivan. And it's a little piece of my heart out in the world. It's a story that really helps children understand what ambiguous loss is, how to cope with it, and also gives adults the language to talk about the uncertainty and the painful losses that children go through when they're unable to be cared for by their biological parents. I'm also a trauma survivor myself, and a girl mom. I have a daughter who is everything to me, and I spend lots of time with her. Just she's super active, and we've been skiing a lot this season. So in this picture over here, I thought this might make everybody laugh a little bit. That's me in the 90s on the right with my bangs, and that's my mom. I lost my mom suddenly when she was 52 years old. She died in her sleep one night. And that was a traumatic experience for me because we were very close to one another. And so that's what has inspired me to get into this type of work and to help other people who are struggling with trauma and loss. The person in the middle is my brother. And yeah, so I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit more. So what is ambiguous loss? It is a big word that means a loss that's unclear and ongoing, a situation or problem that doesn't have any resolution. I like to make it very clear that it's not a mental health diagnosis, but a framework for understanding loss and grief. And it doesn't have to involve a death, even though the word loss is in there. It can involve death, but it doesn't always have to. It's a natural emotional response humans have to knowing that a loved one is both here and not here. So it's not pathological. It's not that they're sick or mentally ill. It's that this is a normal reaction that people have when they are caught between wanting to hold on to the past and wanting to move forward at the same time. We all suffer from ambiguous loss every day, and in different situations. So it's a very common experience that most people just don't have words for. And people don't normally talk about or hear about this type of loss, but it's so common and it happens in our everyday life. So there's been so many losses due to the pandemic. Some of those are the loss of rituals, the loss of celebrations, the loss of marriage, marriage ceremonies, the loss of funerals, the loss of time spent in a hospital with a loved one if you couldn't be there because of the restrictions. So there's been lots of those type of losses. But then there's also just the loss of feeling safe in your everyday life. And I think that might be the one that's most pervasive across our communities today, is that everybody has this we used to just walk around the world feeling safe and certain that for the most part we were going to be okay, and all of that was suddenly ripped away from us when the pandemic began almost 2 years ago. So that's an incredible loss that just has not really been acknowledged, and I just want to put that out there for you, that if you've been feeling really anxious, depressed, and just on edge, that there's good reason for that. This type of loss is painful and it affects your mental health. So another type of loss is what most of you are here to learn about tonight, which is foster care, kinship care, and adoptive families. That those situations aren't the loss themselves; it's the loss of a relationship with the biological family for the child. Um, and then there's also just breakups and divorces. There's a parent who is overly preoccupied with work, with their phone, with computers, with gaming, with addictions. It could be any number of things for why the parent is preoccupied. And then moving to a new community could be a type of loss that people go through every day. Even a pet who runs away for children, that can be a type of ambiguous loss because there may be no resolution if they can't find the pet. Even a child's mother who has a miscarriage. A lot of times people don't think that miscarriages affect the children in the family, but unfortunately they do, and the children are aware and they are grieving. And then there's the example of even on the loss of a beloved toy, that can create a sense of loss and grief in children. So these are just some more like obvious or everyday things that you might not, or actually not so obvious, but things that are happening every day that are types of ambiguous loss. So there's two types of ambiguous loss. There's type 1, which is a physical absence with a psychological presence. So that means like somebody who is physically here on earth, but mentally or psychologically not present within the family. So that would be your foster care, kinship care, adoption situations, incarceration of a family member, military deployment, any situation where the person is not in the child's life, but is psychologically present. And then type 2 is psychological absence with physical presence. So the person may be present in the child's life, but is unavailable due to addictions, maybe their own grief, depression, preoccupation with different life choices, even romantic relationships. A person who's really focused on their romantic relationships and not engaging with the child. These are all types of losses that happen. But then there's more severe things too, like a psychological absence could be somebody with Alzheimer's or dementia. And so the person is still here on earth, but psychologically absent. And I can probably think of even more than that, but to save time, we won't keep going. Oftentimes they overlap. So type 1 and type 2 can overlap in the same person, couple, or family. An example of this would be um, if a mother passes away or dies, you have the father who's grieving a literal death. You have the child then who's grieving a literal death, and then also probably grieving the ambiguous loss of his father at the same time, because if the father's grief is complicated or he's unable to really cope with it, then he may be feeling, kind of distant and shut off from people. And so in a severe situation with grief, the child can experience both like the literal death of their mother, while also grieving like the emotional loss of their father's involvement in their life. So that's just an example. Either type can be catastrophic or more common. It depends on many factors. Each child will react differently based on their past trauma and loss, their level of sensitivity, and the support system in place. So I always think it's important for people to realize that this is a type of trauma, and trauma is subjective, meaning that everybody who interacts with the same event might react differently. So there's no one size fits all when it comes to trauma. Some people will have a trauma response and other people won't. And there's just really no way to tell ahead of time. But what we do know is that relationships are the most important mitigating factor for children. It's the strength of their relationships, the consistency of their relationships, the amount of validation, empathy, compassion, and love and care that a child receives each day. Those are the things that mitigate the impact of these types of trauma. So, why does this matter? For a lot of reasons. It can lead to PTSD, anxiety, and depression if it's unresolved, like if it's unacknowledged. Um, it can often be overlooked as an explanation for child behavior. So if you're having a child who's really struggling in school, or if you're a school counselor, if you're a social worker, and suddenly the child is exhibiting really difficult behavior, this is one of the things you want to rule out. Has there been any type of loss, not just death, but any type of loss, significant loss in the child's life? And you want to think about some of the scenarios I gave you earlier, because if you find out that there is a loss, then you know that this is likely what's causing the behavior. A child who's experiencing ambiguous loss feels isolated and stuck in their grief. It doesn't allow you to move forward if you don't have anyone who's acknowledging the loss. And that's why people get stuck, is because this type of loss is not recognized in everyday life. And if the child doesn't have any acknowledgement for what they're feeling, how can they possibly process through the feelings that they're going through? How can they talk to anybody about it? How do they know it's okay to talk about it? And most times, parents just aren't aware that the child is having this type of grief. And so we really have to work at checking in with the child. If you work with a child and you're not their parent, having that, being that safe, reliable person for them and that comfort to them, you'll be amazed what they might share with you at school or on the bus or in a therapy session. But you always want to kind of have your antennas up for any type of loss for the child, especially in foster care and kinship care and adoption, because they've already experienced so much loss already. So they're already in a state of ambiguous loss. And then if they have repeat or additional losses, that is going to trigger their primary loss of their biological parent and all the pain and emotions that come up with that. So, preventing those types of significant losses can be helpful if possible. Of course, it's not always possible. Loss is a part of life. We can't avoid. So then we're on to some mental and physical health problems that can arise. We've talked about how it can leave people feeling like they just can't settle themselves. They're anxious, they're on edge, they might act out, have aggression, or they could avoid and be shut down, not participating in family activities, not wanting to get close to people, pushing people away with their behavior. So you kind of see it in both directions. And it just really depends on the personality of the child and what they've experienced and the type of support that they have around them. So again, just checking for that ambiguous loss, it kind of rules out as a cause for behavior challenges. If you come across some behaviors that you're just like, I don't know what is going on, consider that it could be a grief response. The effects of ambiguous loss, this is for not just children, but for everybody. It immobilizes an individual and their relationships. It it confuses decision making, whether or not to like move forward or not. Do I move on or do I keep hoping? They're kind of stuck in this limbo. Pauline Boss, who is the originator of the term ambiguous loss and who did all the research on this, she calls it, what does she call it? Grief limbo. Like you're kind of like living in between two realities. The person is both here in their minds and in their heart, but they're also gone at the same time. And that tug of war on your heart is what creates the inner tension and turmoil that you see children grappling with. That's why it's so important to help them to acknowledge this type of loss, but also to put a word to it, explain to them that it is a normal process that we go through and that there's nothing wrong with them for feeling this way. It inhibits the grief process, it blocks the coping processes, and leads to feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, and exhaustion. And of course, anxiety and uncertainty about the future. So these are the reasons why it's so important to pay attention to ambiguous loss. All right, we'll keep going. And Deborah, let me know if anybody like puts a question in the chat that pertains to any of the information I'm sharing. I'm happy to kind of answer
Okay, I will.
questions here and there as I'm going along if it's relevant to what we're talking about. So it also brings up some relationship problems. We have family conflict, ending of family rituals and celebrations, mistrust of caregivers like foster parents, social workers, doctors, police, and the child may avoid relationships, push people away. So this experience kind of makes you question everything around you, makes you feel like you can't trust the people. That's why one of the main ways to help and alleviate some of what the child is experiencing is by building trust with the child and making sure that you're doing everything you can to be honest with them, upfront with them, and share any age appropriate information that you have. Of course, you don't want to overwhelm a child with too much information and details, but if you can speak to them in an age appropriate way and tell them the truth about their life, that is going to have a huge impact on their ability to heal and to move forward. I know that there's lots of people with great intentions to not want to harm the child anymore by telling them the truth about their life. But what we know from these situations is that it always creates more problems later on down the road when they find out that the people they love were not able to be honest with them. So what you really want to do is work with a coach or work with somebody or get support or counseling to make sure that you are telling the children the truth about their life, even though it may be hard and even though it may be disturbing on some levels. They need to know the truth so that they can feel grounded. So the good news is, I know that was a lot of sort of dark and upsetting information, and I can feel it in my body just talking about it because I feel all like I need to like breathe a little bit here. That's a lot, and I experienced this type of loss in my own life. I'm part of a family who is divorced. My parents divorced when I was 2, and we lived very far apart from each other. So I lived in Maine, and my dad lived in New York, and my stepmom. And it was an ambiguous loss for me, because I had to long for people who were far away, and I couldn't always be in 2 places at once, even though I wanted to be. And so it stirred up a lot of emotions in me as a child. And it's something that I think affects me to this day as an adult. I have done a lot of therapy to process it and work. I constantly am working on my own self-care and taking good care of myself. So I'm doing well, but the reason I bring that up is just because I want people to know that I understand this from a lived experience. I wasn't in foster care or kinship care, and I'm not adoptive, but I have an idea of what this feels like on a personal level, although I could never know exactly what it feels like. So children only need one consistent, loving adult in their life to really get through these adversities. And there's lots of research to back this up. Harvard University has done extensive research on what makes children resilient. And what they find is that they really only need one consistent, loving adult who's honest with them, compassionate, empathetic, and consistent. And that is what it takes for children to really overcome these challenges. It's not always going to work. It's not going to be 100%, but if they have at least one person, then they should be able to work through these things. And the more healthy relationships a child has, the better off they'll be. So if we do whatever you can to get them into more relationships if possible, so whether that be through community activities, through a mentor, through group therapy, any type of relationship building that you can do for the child is very important and helpful to their healing process. Be that one person they can trust, especially children in foster care and kinship care. They often have their trust broken, and it's probably was broken by mom and dad, early on in their life, and now they are uncertain of everybody. Who can I trust? If my own parents can let me down, how can I trust this foster parent? And so I help families understand that children in this situation need to be able to trust you first. So they're not going to trust you first. You need to earn their trust. Does that make sense? I know as an adult, like that can feel upside down, right? It's like I'm the adult, you need to earn my trust, child. But in these situations, it's not helpful because they've had their foundational trust broken, and they need to feel safe first, and they need to feel that they can trust you first before they're going to act trustworthy in most cases. So you can be that person for them. And that will provide the comfort and reduce the likelihood of mental health problems down the road. Does anyone have questions at this point? Because I feel like I'm about halfway through. You can put them in the chat if you'd like. So how do we help children get unstuck? And this is going to be a couple of slides of things that you can do, really practical stuff that you can do to help children get unstuck. So this is where you either want to take notes or screenshots or whatever might be helpful to you. So number one, I've talked about a lot already, is to acknowledge the loss. Just that in and of itself is going to really alleviate a lot of anxiety that they're experiencing. Because if you haven't acknowledged it yet, or you don't acknowledge it very frequently, they're already thinking about it all the time. And doing that alone and in isolation just is so frustrating for the brain to just keep going over and over and over these things. You need an outlet for it. So as an adult, if you can be that outlet for them and acknowledge their loss, that can be incredibly helpful to these children. So pointing out, I wonder if if you notice something going on, a behavior change, whether it's sadness or anger or whatever it might be. Now, this is a really general statement. You have to kind of make it fit your situation, but I give an example. I wonder if you're feeling angry because you miss your dad, like just bringing it up every once in a while and asking them how they're feeling, and wondering, maybe is this because you're missing your dad or your mom or whoever it might be. So that kind of brings it into the light of day. And a lot of times as adults, it's our instinct to want to not talk about these really hard things because it's maybe uncomfortable for ourselves. And I know that feeling too, because I am the mother of a daughter, and she's a sensitive little soul. And because my mom is not here on the earth, she grieves. She's grieving an ambiguous loss. She sees and feels the love that I have for my mother. And she'll say to me, I miss Grandma Joyce. And just out of nowhere, she'll say it. And she's only 6. And she'll say, I miss Grandma Joyce. And she's never met her. And so she grieves for her. And so I just want to show you that even for someone the child has never even met, there can be a grief process going on. So bringing it into the light of day and normalizing it and letting them know that it's okay to have these feelings is going to move them along on their path through this difficult experience. So normalize the ambiguity, talk about it, point out ambiguous situations, like even everyday things like going to work. And while they're at school, that's an ambiguous situation, right? You want to be with your children, but you also need to work. So that's a type of ambiguity that everybody experiences, and you can kind of point that out to them. if you don't have an exact experience that they're going through. You can say, I feel this too sometimes. It's on a different in a different way and a different level, but when you're at school during the day and I have to work, like, I miss you and I really wish that you and I could be together. And that's a type of ambiguous loss too. So letting them know that there's everyday types of losses that we're all experiencing will help them feel less alone in what they're going through and normalizes the experience. So being empathetic is often another thing that is super critical for helping children through this. Even if you don't understand it, even if it seems silly, even if it's like, why are you so upset because you lost your necklace or whatever it might be? They may not be telling you exactly the meaning behind that item or that thing. And so even if you don't get it or it doesn't make sense to you, if they are grieving something or upset about the loss of something, validate it for them. Use empathy. Say, I can see this really hurts you, really hurt you to lose that. I can see you're really sad about that. It's normal to feel sad when you lose something. So that sort of active listening and reflecting back to them what they're experiencing will allow them to express more instead of shutting them down. So it's normal to feel sad that your dog ran away and letting them know that that's okay. Um, so for families who, so for foster, kinship, and adoptive families, some things you can do is share positive stories if possible and limit negative stories about the biological parent. I know that in the families I worked with, children often overhear very negative information about their biological parents. And this is not helpful to children, especially children who are grieving. Children identify themselves with their biological parents. And so anything you say negatively about the biological parent is going to make them feel shameful about themselves because children see themselves as a literal part of their parents. And they figure, okay, well, if mom and dad are bad, then so am I. And I better live up to that expectation. So trying to stay as positive as possible or neutral. If you can't possibly find anything good to say, which I will argue with you on that, I think you can, um, because I do believe that there's good in everybody and that people are always doing the best that they can, even if it's not very well. That's the best that they can do at this time. And so sharing something positive, a memory you have from a long time ago, or pointing out positive qualities the person gave the child. So things like, you have your mom's beautiful eyes, you have your dad's smile, you have a sense of humor like Pop Pop. Whoever the person is that's missing, you can point out the positive qualities that were passed down to them. And this can be very comforting to a child who has no connection otherwise to the person who's gone. So acknowledge the person who's missing during holidays is another important thing, or birthdays, or any special typical rituals or celebrations that your family goes through. Try to incorporate them. Um, my mother-in-law made this book for Christmas for everybody, for the kids. She does it every year. It's like she's a graphic designer, and so she creates these books for the kids. They're always like funny but educational. And on the back, she put something about all the people. It was about all the people that have come before us. It's kind of like a book about who has come before you and how it has helped you get to where you are. And she included my mom on the back of the book, and it meant so much for me to see her picture amongst all the other family members who are still alive, to have her acknowledged. It was a real comfort to me, even though my mother-in-law has never met my mom, and my mom has been gone for 16 years. So that never wears off, is my point. No matter how much time goes by, continuing to acknowledge the person can be really soothing and helpful. And look at photos if you can, or if you don't have any photos of the person, visit a location that's special to that person. When I was working with foster families, sometimes they didn't have any connection at all to their past. Nothing. No photos, no information, not even a name, nothing. And so we would have some information like where the child was born, the hospital the child was born in. So one of my colleagues actually took their client, the child, to see the hospital where they were born. And it was something physical on this earth, in this place, that grounded them to who they are and where they began, where their story began. And so I think that there's so much power in doing these things, and kind of going on a hunt to find ways to include the person in a positive way, even if it's not photos or like actually spending time with that person. It could be visiting a location, it could be the smell of a perfume, it could be any number of things. And then, as I talked about earlier, it's always important to be telling the truth in age appropriate terms. And that's why another reason why I wrote A Grand Family for Sullivan was because it is so hard to talk to children about these really hard things. And as a therapist, even, that was my job, right? Was to go and talk to these families about the hard times they were going through. And oftentimes I'd bring a book, because books are such an, like, not easy, but they're a bridge. They're a bridge to the child's world, is the way I like to think about it. And if you have a really difficult topic to share or to explain to them, a book is a really great way to start. And with young children, the pictures and the visuals and the words are so important to them. It really helps them conceptualize what they're going through. So I wrote the book to give age appropriate language for adults. So yes, the book is for children, but it's also a tool for adults. And I just wanted to share that, because there are resources out there that, if you don't know what to say, if you're afraid to say it, there is support. There are resources out there to help you talk with them. So some more things we can do is increase tolerance for ambiguity and change. So we don't want to completely shelter the child from all adversity. Children need a moderate dose of stress and hardships throughout life, so that they know what to do when something hard really happens, and so that they can pick themselves back up. Resilience is something that's built. It's not something that people are born with. So you want to kind of, I think of it with my own child as like doses of adversity. You don't want it to be too much. You don't want it to be too little. You kind of have to find a balance of what they struggle with. So, it's okay for children to struggle at times. Adversity does strengthen us, but only to a point. If you have way too much, and too much stress and too much adversity, it overwhelms the child. But if you have, that a little bit of adversity and challenge in life is also important. So just want to point that out. This seems pretty obvious, but I put it in here because maybe it's not to everybody. I don't know what everybody's experience has been, but closure is not the solution. We always talk about with grief, finding closure, having closure. I don't really know if closure is possible in these situations. I know for myself, my mom's been gone for 16 years, but I don't have closure. I think closure is an expectation for us to kind of just get over it, and to push it aside, to hide our feelings of grief. And most people who have had a significant loss in their life continue some type of psychological relationship even though the person has died. So even though we're talking about ambiguous loss, even in a real death, it's still ambiguous, because I have a continuing relationship with my mom. I pray to her, I think about her, I talk about her, I share stories about her. And like I said, even my own child has a relationship with her, and they've never met. So there really isn't closure. And children don't get over these things, they learn to live with it. And helping them find a way to maintain some sort of connection psychologically, if the person is gone physically, can be helpful. So over time, helping them find meaning in the loss. And I share this, but this is really for like down the road. You don't want to jump to helping them find meaning if the loss is fresh, or if the loss is still really tumultuous and like a constant upheaval, which I know for a lot of kinship families, it can kind of be that way. And for foster families where mom and dad are coming in and out of their life all the time. So, it's triggering them and bringing up feelings all the time. But over time, people tend to find meaning in these losses by giving back to others who are in their situation, starting a support group, or volunteering for a nonprofit who supports these types of families in these situations. The work I do is my way of making meaning of my loss. And it brings me great peace to know that I'm doing something that will help other people who are suffering. So um, don't overlook that as a possibility, as long as the child has had some time to process what they're going through, has had support and therapy. That if they're feeling ready, that maybe getting involved in giving back to their community in some way can be incredibly healing as well. So, some other things: expressive play, expressive arts, and group therapy. So, expressive play, um, so play therapy for young children is very helpful and can really provide them with a lot of ways to heal from their loss and to live with the ongoing uncertainty. And but you can also, I put expressive play there instead of play therapy because you can actually help them do some of this on their own at home by providing little figures of family members and giving them like a dollhouse or something that looks like a home, and allow them to just play with those figurines and those toys in any way that they want. And you might not understand what's happening, it might not make sense, or you might not even notice anything that pertains to the loss, but children process their emotions through play, and that is helping them to heal and to process everything that they've been through. So making sure that they have that those type of toys in the house can be really helpful. Sand tray is another thing that people do. It's called sand tray art, and it's basically like a sensory board with sand in it, and they have figurines, and they make a picture with all the different parts. So you can look those things up online, but I encourage you to have those things at home. And anytime the child is playing, you can kind of like sit back and just observe and notice if you see any themes around loss, and know that that's helping them, that's helpful to them. And you don't have to get involved in the play, you can just be a quiet observer. You can sportscast, which I like to call it, which is where you kind of like just say what they're doing, like, oh, I see mom is taking the baby to the store, whatever the child is doing, you kind of just sportscast it. You say what they're doing, but you don't interrupt them. You don't try to direct them in any way or judge what they're doing in any way. And then expressive arts, so drawing, painting, music, singing, uh, acting, all those types of expressive arts are a great way for children to process their emotions around ambiguous loss. In group therapy, I put a couple other bullet points here because it is very, very helpful to know that you're not alone in this situation, and have your story, be able to share your story with peers, because peers are so important to children. And that's really like that's like where they get all, especially for older kids, that's where they, the parent and the caregivers become less the focus of their attention, and their peers become more the focus of their attention. So if you have a group therapy or a support group that has other children going through these things, that's incredibly powerful for them to hear the stories of others and be inspired by their peers. Some other things here: memory boxes, just like a box that maybe you decorate in a special way, and you put any memories that you have of the person in there, and then every once in a while ask them to go through it with you and to talk about the memories that are in the box. Life books, this is something you could find on Amazon. If you just search for life books, there's lots of great ones out there. This is helping children develop a narrative for their life, and foster care families usually have these. But if you don't, I highly encourage you to create a life book with your children in foster care and kinship care, because there might be pieces of their past that just will get lost if you don't create that for them. And these books can follow them along through their journey. If they're moved to different homes or different locations, if you don't have a narrative and like a cohesive memory of your past, can be really hard to develop a sense of identity, which is something that teens really need to do as a developmental task as they age. And so these life books can kind of be that missing piece, and you can be a part of providing that missing piece for them if you're the foster family or kinship family, by collecting anything you have, memories of their early childhood, pictures, mementos, drawings they did, whatever it may be, that can tell the story of their life. Journaling is good for everybody, adults included. I've kept a journal since I was 10. I still have all of them, and I frequently will look back through them, to be like, what was going on in my life at that point? If I question something, because I don't have my mom, I don't have her to ask about certain things. And I'm so grateful that I have my journal. And not only that, but when you get your feelings out onto paper, it frees up the space in your brain to cope with other emotions and other things that are going on. And it's also a great activity to do before bedtime, because you can kind of empty your mind of everything you're worrying about onto the paper, and it will help you relax and calm down to sort of shut your brain off and go to sleep. Plants and animals can be very soothing and healing for children and adults. Animals are incredible healers, and plants, I mentioned plants because I find that, like, being out in nature is very, very comforting to me. And like sitting under a big tree. And I know that might sound a little silly or whatever, but plants and like sitting under a huge tree to me has so many meanings, and it's protecting you from the elements. And it's, you know, a lot of people equate a large tree, to like a mother figure. And so spending time in nature in a way that's meaningful, or spending time with animals, can, ease some of the grief that children are feeling. Um, Painting memory rocks is another thing. You get those big flat stones and you paint um, words or something about the person on the rocks and put them somewhere special. You could also light a candle and other rituals during holidays. One thing I think is a really great idea is, if there's a missing loved one, is to light an extra candle on their birthday cake every year, to signify that person, so that they're included in the celebration. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier, but finding a mentor for the child is critical. There's lots of organizations that you can find in your area. There's the Boys and Girls Club. There's probably many others that I can't think of off the top of my head. But if you just Google up like local mentoring or mentors, you should be able to find something in your area most of the time. And making sure that this is like a long-term mentoring situation, not somebody that's short-term, would be important as well. So what are some things, let me see, what time am I on? How much time do I have left, Deborah? Oh, I see my counter there. Okay.
7:23.
Okay, cool. Thanks. So what makes it harder to cope is expecting that a child's not thinking about these things. They are always thinking about the person who is missing. And you might not realize it, because maybe they seem happy, or maybe they seem engaged in other things, and maybe they're playing and you're like, oh no, they're fine. They're fine. Well, that's maybe comforting to you, but as the child who's going through it, they are thinking about it. And so not talking about it does more harm than actually bringing it up. Expecting the child to come to you when they're upset is also a no. Children typically won't come to you, especially teens, won't come right out and tell you that they are feeling sad and upset about things. They might try to get your attention in either positive or negative ways. But they most likely won't come right out and say, I'm really missing mom. Instead, it's going to come out through their behavior, or maybe it's going to come out because they say, I have a stomach ache that has no like medical reason for it. Or there's all different ways that grief presents itself. Could be headaches, insomnia, nightmares, diarrhea, all different types of things. Now, of course, you always want to have a doctor or medical professional check those things out as well. But sometimes if you can't find a reason for these things medically, it's the grief and the trauma that the child is experiencing. So keep that in mind as well. And some other things that makes it hard to cope is shaming the child for their grief, saying things like, oh, don't cry, it's fine, everything's okay. Those things are natural for parents to say. I catch myself doing it too. We're not perfect. And, it's just easier. It just rolls right off the tongue to say, you don't need to cry, everything's going to be all right. But for them, that can be invalidating, the way that they're really feeling. So turning in towards the feelings your child is having can feel really scary, because it's like, oh, I don't want to open a can of worms. But by keeping the lid on the worms, it's just going to pop pop off later, and there's going to be more worms flying out of that can later on. So I always encourage families to allow their feelings to come out. They need to be expressed. Their sadness and their rage is valid for what they've experienced, and they need to have an outlet and a trusting adult who can sit with them and be present in their pain and not feel alone. So saying things like, oh, well, Sophie down the street, she just moved here too, and she's not upset. These are things parents, we make these mistakes. We say these things because we're frustrated. And honestly, it's because it's painful to watch a child be in pain. There's probably nothing more painful than seeing a child in any type of pain, whether it's emotional or physical. And our intention is to stop the pain, but unfortunately, it's counterproductive to their emotional well-being to bottle these things up and ignore them. So I encourage you just to trust that process, that it's okay for them to let out their feelings with you. Denying or minimizing their feelings, like, oh, it's just a dog. We'll get another one. Or your mom was never there for you anyway. Why do you care that she's not here? It's hard. It's hard not to sort of think those things, but if you can, trying to be more intentional with the way you respond to your children's feelings can make a big difference in how they cope with their stress. What makes it harder? A few more things. Silence. So meaning like not bringing it up, not talking about it. Secrets, keeping secrets, or the child not knowing the truth of their lives, which I talked about earlier. Additional significant separations can be triggers for children. So you want to, when you can, try and limit those. But obviously that's not always possible. Lack of trust with new caregivers, so not feeling safe with the people who are supposed to be safe, and dishonest explanations. So, not telling, like making up a story. And I share with adults that children, if they don't know the truth, 9 times out of 10, they're going to make up a story and tell themselves something that's even worse than what the truth is. So you're better off just telling them with with some tact and with some grace, and with being cognizant of your delivery, and in a loving and comforting way. But if they don't know what's happening in their lives, they're likely to just to make up a story, and that's not going to be helpful, because they do, at the bottom I see, are likely to create trauma responses. So in conclusion, everyone experiences ambiguous loss. Children typically don't talk about it, but it affects them greatly. Just because a child seems happy doesn't mean he or she is not grieving. Young children, like a lot of, this is a big one I see in the work that I do, is it's like, well, she was an infant. She'd never even met so and so, and that's just not true. If there's been the loss of a biological parent, that is a lifelong grieving process that's going to be with them forever, whether they met the person or not, whether they were 2 years old or 10 years old. Children under the age of 5 may not have a visual memory, right? They may not be able to recall a memory physically, like see what happened, but emotionally they have memories, and the emotional memories live inside their body. And so if they had a significant loss or an ongoing ambiguous loss as a young child, it is still affecting them. It's not, just because they don't remember it or talk about it doesn't mean it's not affecting them. They express grief differently, like I mentioned earlier, through play and peer interactions. And you can help children by acknowledging the loss. I think I've said that enough tonight. And talk to child's teacher and school counselor. Yes, that's super important. Letting the teachers and the school counselors know if there's been an ambiguous, or if there's an ongoing ambiguous loss. It's important for the school to know about. Make a home for their grief. Be their soft place to land. Be the person they can turn to. And always be as honest as you can, empathetic, and consistent in your behavior with them. So that's the end of the educational part. I just love to share about my book. It has over 100 5-star reviews on Amazon. I'm super proud of it. It's only been out there for 2 years. I self-published it, so I don't have a publishing company behind it. Everything I do for the book is just out of my heart for these families and for your families, and just wanting to help people feel a little bit less alone. It provides skills to help children with ambiguous loss and models the vocabulary and the words that will help you speak to your grandchildren or your foster children. Um, and it also introduces mindfulness practices in a child-friendly manner, as well as tips and guides and resources in the back for grandparents, adults, social workers, and anybody who touches the life of a child in these situations. This is the screen I tell people if they want to take a picture of so that we can stay in touch. I'd love to provide a training for you, for your organization, for anyone who needs to learn more about this. This affects all children in every community, and most people are not talking about it. There's not a whole lot of people speaking on this, and I think it's just so critical right now. So if you would like to schedule a training or a webinar, please reach out to me. You can find me on social media. And I have a Facebook group called Emotiminds that is private and is full of other grand families, foster families, professionals, mental health professionals, teachers, or school counselors, all different types of people who are interested in learning more about improving the wellness of children. So thank you guys for participating. I guess we will take some question and answer now for a little bit and just see what we have to talk about here. I hope this was helpful for everybody. And again, I'm just so thrilled that you are all able to be here tonight.
There were a few questions in the chat. Someone has an experience they would like to share that recently happened to them. And then someone also asked a question about, do you have any recommendations for books for preteens who have been separated from their siblings through foster care? Someone already suggested The Invisible String.
Yes, I do have that book. I use that book all the time. In fact, the author of that book provided a quote on the back of my book. So her and I know each other. The Invisible String is a good book for talking about or introducing the idea that we all have these invisible strings that keep us connected even though we're apart. And it's just a really beautiful book about how we can, even though we may not be right next to each other or in each other's physical presence, that we're all connected in our hearts to each other. And it's just a really lovely visual for children. And I use that with my daughter all the time. If she feels upset about separating, whether it's at bedtime or going to school, I'll say, don't forget, we have the invisible string. You know, I'm always with you in your heart, even when we're apart. So yes, I do recommend that book. And I can't think, let's see, preteens separated from siblings. I might have to get back to you on that one, but I will look that up and see if I can find something. I don't have anything off the top of my head, and I've been asked that before, so maybe I need to write one.
Okay, and then the other question, and then I'll let the other person who wanted to share something. This person says they're an early childhood educator and frequently hears an aunt yelling at her nephew when he talks about his bio mom, and she shuts him down and punishes him whenever he says anything about the bio mom. And she is at a loss of how to do herself to deal with that. How would you recommend she?
Yeah, that's a tough one. You know, I because I'm not in this situation, I really can't give like direct advice and guidance from a mental health perspective on that without more information and having a relationship. So I think that one's something that I could talk to the person about, or refer that person to resources in their local community that might be helpful.
Okay.
But yeah, I just, there's a fine line between, providing educational information and providing, personal direct advice. So I just want to be aware and conscious of that. But
Okay.
if that person could email me, that would be the best way I could support them.
Okay, and then I've got to go back in the messages here to see. Is it ACES? I'm trying to think, are you still on here and did you have something you wanted to share? I'm trying to see if she's. A lot of people have signed off and I'm not sure if she's still on.
Well, we could also just unmute if anybody wants to ask a question out loud. Then they
That's
can
fine.
unmute themselves or raise their hand. Do you have the raise hand option?
Yeah, do you want to stop sharing your, yeah,
Yep.
then we can see if hands go up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see. Did I think I am shared right now.
Okay, so for
So
me,
any questions anybody would like? Oh, I did see a hand. Where did it just go?
Yes,
Virginia.
I do know that even a newborn, even they don't visual, no parent or nothing. I had my niece. Am I froze?
Yeah,
there.
you're okay.
Let me see you.
I had my niece since birth. And she cried and cried and cried every day for a whole year. And I took her to the doctor. They kept telling me nothing was wrong. So finally, the doctor said, I need you to take her to a counselor. I'm like at a year old. I was like, what? So I wasn't even there 5 minutes for him to tell me. A child stays in the womb for 9 months with the mother. And they get to smell the mother, hear the mother's voice. They know everything about the mother.
Yes.
And the thing was, my sister lived upstairs above me in the apartment above me. So when her mom would come home, that's when the crying would start.
Hmm.
That connection was there, and that he said the only how you're going to help that is you got to move. The very first night I moved into my own home, boom, she never cried.
Hmm.
So that's how I know that a child does have that instinct that there's something there, but they can't put it out there what their feelings are, because they can't talk, so they can't express that. So that was the only way she could express, is crying.
Hmm.
And I thought I was going crazy or something was wrong with the baby. Here I'm going to call the doctor every week. Look, this is still going on. But it's a connection that kids have with their parents.
Absolutely.
And they never lose it. Now she's 34 today, and her and her mom, they're tight, they're good and that. But I know for experience that kids have that instinct, and they have that, they need someone to talk to. Because when my sister, as she got older, as my sister would come by, she would get kind of funny, jittery, all overwhelmed. And it's like, okay, now she got to calm down. It's 6 hours later. Her mom done left. It's time to calm down. And she could never put her feelings together till she got older. And I explained to her why she would act that way when her real mom came around, because it was her real mom. And she knew something was the matter, because she was just so jittery, and she was like a loose butterfly in the sky sometimes. And that, but I know it there. I had to take her to a counselor for them to tell me that.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think that's going to resonate with a lot of people, and hopefully shift the way that we look at babies, right? I mean, they have so much intelligence that we don't give them credit for, and the emotional connection that forms in the womb is just as powerful as a real life connection, skin to skin connection, and it's a lifelong loss when you lose a
Just
parent.
remember, she was 3 days old, and that lasts for a whole year of crying. And here it took a counselor to tell me what was going on.
Well, I'm glad you found the right counselor. I think that was
Yes.
the best thing to do.
Yes.
Because let me tell you, there are a
It took
lot of
long
people
time
who
for the
don't
doctor to
realize
say
that.
this is it. You want a counseling.
Yes,
But
yes.
it worked.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with us.
And there's 2 questions in the chat that are similar. They want to know if there's anything to help with upcoming loss. They're parents of foster children who will be going through termination of parental rights of the biological family, and how can they best prepare the children for this
Oh yeah, I
loss?
could do a whole webinar on that.
Mm.
Yeah, I think, there's definitely, you want to start introducing the idea of loss, and consider consider it a grieving process that they'll be going through, and an incredible, adoption is ambiguous, right? Because it's a happy time for the people who are involved, that the adoption is happening, but it's also a really sad time because it's the end of a relationship in another direction. It's the end of
Mhm.
the biological relationship, and in a lot of ways. And so it is often a very difficult situation for children. It's important to look at it as a loss and not just a celebration, but also incorporate kind of both, like it's kind of, life is not black and white. We live in the gray area. Life is uncertain for everybody. And the more that we can normalize that, and the more that we can show people that they can have two feelings or more at the same time, and that's okay. That we don't feel happy all the time, and that's okay. That it's okay to feel sad at things that are normally happy. That's okay, and just letting them know that that this is going to be hard, but also, the fact that you are the one that will be there for them, and that you are happy to be in their life. So it's like balancing the two at the same time, which is exactly what they're doing. They are holding two very difficult truths in their minds at the same time. And there is no solution for that, right? Like I have this webinar and everything, and I wish I had a clear solution to all of this, but I don't. And the reality is that we have to, as adults, teach children that the ability to like hold two conflicting things at the same time in their hearts and in their minds, because it's inevitable that it will happen, and to ignore that is not helpful. So I want to try and read the question a little bit. Preparation of a loss for these bio parents' rights being terminated. I was a few minutes late. Okay. Thank you for sharing that, Catherine. I'm glad you made it on with us tonight. I would be happy to give you some more people that have that specific question. I'd be happy to email you with some more guidance for that, and how to prepare. But there's definitely things that you can do. You want to have the conversation. Don't avoid the conversation. Talk about what it feels like to grieve. Talk about the symptoms that they might feel, so you can get ahead of it. So if you just get blindsided by the grief responses and the trauma response, you think something's wrong with you. And if nobody's talking about it, then you think there's really something wrong with you. But if you can tell somebody ahead of time, this is going to be a big loss for you. It's going to keep coming up over time as you age, different developmental points in your life, where you understand it in a whole new way as you mature. And these are some of the symptoms that you might feel in your body. These are some of the thoughts you might have, and really educate yourself on what it's like to grieve if you've never grieved a loss like this before, and share with them times that you've experienced a loss. So children really can relate when they love to hear stories about your life. And so if you can share with them a time when you had a significant loss and what helped you and how you got through it, that's another way that's going to help them feel less alone in what they're going through. Even if it's not the same exact situation, you can always find something to connect with them about. And so yeah, I hope that was a little bit helpful. But I can certainly share more information with you one-on-one if you'd like.
Okay. There was another question on how do you tell your truth when their mom then contradicts your truth with her own, and it just confuses the kids.
Yeah, that's a common one. I see that a lot. Again, this is one of those things where there's not a whole lot of great way to handle it. So the way you're gonna combat that is by being the trustworthy one, right? You're going to lead by that example of always being as honest as you can with them, as being the person they can trust, as following your word, keeping your word with them. They're going to know instinct. They're going to pick up on that, right? They're going to pick up on the difference between the person who's not keeping the word, the person who's letting them down, the person who's, telling them stories that never come true versus the person who always is telling the truth and always is the person that's there for them. They're smart. They're going to know that. And so when you say something and you say, it's unfortunate that your mom shared that with you. That's not the truth. And it's my job to always be honest with you. And so I want to tell you what the truth is. That's going to hold more weight than, what's coming from her if she's been very inconsistent and not, telling the truth all the time. So you really that's why I talked so much about building that trust, because it's really crucial.
I know with my kids, it was kind of like a waiting game. I would always be very honest with them. And if they heard something contradictory from their biological parents, they had two sides. They were trying to weigh it out. And then as months or years went on, they would see what the truth was. They will see it. So right at the moment, they may not understand it, but as time goes on, some of my kids now are in their 30s and 40s, and they were adopted very young. And so now they can look back and say, yeah, what you said, and they see the difference and everything. So it's hard when you're in the moment, and they're saying, but that's not what she said and everything. But in the long run, as long as you're honest and consistent, it does pay off.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that.
Does anyone else have any questions?
I see this question from Krista. This is a really good question. Foster son, 20 months, had since he was 3 weeks, bio parents not involved. When and how much do you share with them regarding bio parents and his story? Right away. So the sooner you talk about bio family and the sooner you talk about how they're adopted, the better off for them in the long term. I always tell families that there should be no moment where your child finds out they're adopted. Like there should be, in a perfect world. I mean, granted, it happens. It's sometimes unavoidable, especially if you didn't know this information earlier in their life. But if possible, with a child that young, you have the opportunity for them to have always kind of known this truth about their life. And that's going to ground them, and that's going to give them a piece of their identity. So a great way to start with this is reading books about adoption, reading books about loss, telling them the truth about their life right away. And that will be so much better for them in their mental health than finding out later down the road that you haven't been honest with them this whole time. Because then not only did their parents break their initial trust by not being able to care for them, but now you as the adoptive parent are breaking their trust again. And that is even more detrimental to their long-term well-being. So it's so important. And I'm so glad you asked that question, because you are right at that point in his life where you can be such an impact on the long-term mental health of this child. So I really hope that you can find the courage, because I know it's not easy, to have these difficult conversations with him from the beginning of his life and all the way through. So
I always introduced it to my children when they started asking about babies. They see someone who's pregnant and expecting a baby, and just saying, oh, they're expecting a baby, and just explain, you didn't grow in my tummy, you have a tummy mommy, and, just in real simple terms and everything and all, and they pick up on it, and, it just becomes a word that they have grown up that they're used to. It's not all of a sudden when they're 12, 13 years old, they hear this word adoption and it like freaks them out.
Right. You don't want to blindside the child. And there's Tummy Mummy. Yeah, there's a book called Tummy Mummy, I think. But there's lots of resources. And again, if you would like to email me, I can send you some links to those books. There's a few listed on my website too, at bethtyson.com under resources. But yeah, the books are going to be your bridge to that conversation with the child. So find some really good ones. I always encourage people to read the book first without the child, because some of these books are not great and might just confuse the child more. So read the book first and make sure it's something that you feel comfortable with and it's helpful. And then read it with the child when they're in a calm state, like before bed, or when they're feeling when they're feeling calm and rested, and you have time to reflect on it with them.
Anyone else have any questions for Beth?
Did we miss any?
I don't see any hands up.
I was adopted at 9 months. When I was 40, I found out my birth. I found my birth. Wow, that's amazing. Somebody shared that, Ellen shared that she was adopted at 9 months and at 40 found her birth family. And oh, she's so glad she was adopted. Okay, see, that's, yeah, that can happen too. So yeah, there's all different types of experiences, and it's important that we are sharing with young children right away.
There's one downstairs, should be fine.
No, not that, because what I was gonna get is take your place bills.
So I just want to remind everybody too that if you would like to get on my mailing list, you can put your email in the chat, or you can also visit my website, bethtyson.com, and there's a place to subscribe to my newsletter. There's also the Facebook group Emotimines, where I talk all about family and child well-being, and emotional health and trauma and loss and all that stuff. And let's see, anybody else? Yes, you can share. Hi, Lisa. I see Lisa Duff.
Robert.
Can I share in New Jersey? Absolutely.
Hi,
Hi, how are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
Good. So good to see your face.
I know we've communicated in various other ways, but not
Yeah.
like live, right?
I know. It's so nice to see everybody tonight. I can't believe how
Right.
many people were able to make it. I'm really happy. And I hope it was helpful to everybody. There's so much more to learn. I do all kinds of webinars on different topics. I try to do a couple of free ones like this a year so that I can just get it out to as many people as possible. I see somebody has their hand up.
Yeah, Robert Williams had a hand up.
Yeah, and I see Brian has a raised hand too. Somebody wants.
Before we move on, let me just, I'm going to put it in the chat, but what I wanted to mention is there's two websites called NJ Arch and King Connect. One is the kind of one-stop shopping for resources and connections, and there's a warm line for both of them, so you can call with any kind of questions. One is for the adoption world, and it's really there's a lending library in there, so there's lots and lots and lots and lots of books. And Kin Connect is for the kinship care community. So they link specifically to resources in New Jersey, but they are more than willing to field calls from other states and will help as much as they possibly can. They'll do some research and try and help out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. Any resources that people want to share, please leave in the chat box. And I'll try to get them. I'll try to collect them and send them out. I will be sending out a follow-up email to everybody who attended tonight with hopefully a link to the recording and any other like helpful resources and ways to stay in touch and so forth. Here we have it. I think we have a.
And then Robert had a question.
Okay, yes. Anybody who has a question, please.
Robert.
Okay, I have one question. So I have custody of my grandson, which is 15 years old. So I noticed that you mentioned about pictures and, to the journal together. And I don't know if this is relevant to this conversation tonight, but I always wanted to know the answer to this, and I can't seem to get the right answer. So through his life and his childhood, I would take him all over the place, to the zoo, aquariums, skiing, snowboard. To this day, he has no knowledge of any of those things that we did, him and I. And I'm wondering, is it caused by the physical and mental abuse that he was accustomed to by his parents? And should I, and I do have pictures of all the different places we went to,
Yeah.
Should I bring that up today in his life about what we did?
I think so. I mean, it sounds like that might be really helpful to him to see the photos and the things that he did with you that were really special. They're positive photos, right? They're happy memories. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't see how I mean, I think that would most likely be helpful. I mean, the chat, again, I can't give like direct advice on these things, but from a general standpoint, that is something that I would suggest. I don't know the exact issues and any diagnoses or anything that's going on with, what did you say, it was your grandson or your nephew?
My grandson.
Your grandson, yeah. So I can't speak directly to that, but overall in general, without knowing any other information, I would say that sharing those photos could only be helpful for the
Is
most
there a
part.
reason why he blanked those different things out?
Say that again?
Is there a reason why he blanked all those different events out?
Is there a reason why he might have blanked it out? Yes. So again, without being able to assess him or know anything about him, there are, when children experience trauma, it is common for them to dissociate and to sort of kind of go somewhere else in their mind when they're in the present moment, but mentally they're somewhere else because being in the present is too overwhelming or too scary for them. And so you do see that with children who have a history of trauma. Again, I'm not speaking specifically, I can't specifically say that that's what's going on because I haven't seen him, but yes, that does happen.
Okay.
You're welcome.
And we have two people, Brian and Kayla Henry, that both have their hands up. So would someone like to go first? Yeah. Brian or Kayla?
All right, I'll go first. I have a child in my care that has gone through a significant amount of loss within just a very short period of time. Her mother had passed away, and then she was removed from her dad's care, and then she was also separated from her brother through the foster care agency. And all of that was just in like a 2-week time frame.
Wow.
So with working through all those different types of loss, is it best to work through them individually or more of like a whole?
Good question.
Because she does suffer from a lot of anxiety and depression as it is. So I don't like her therapist and I don't really want to overwhelm her, tackling them like as a whole. But then again, we don't want to put her through, more.
And what is her age again? Yeah.
She's almost 16.
16. Oh, okay. With a younger child, I would say, they understand grief in bits and pieces. So it is something that they, kind of conceptualize over time. And so you kind of want to bring it up multiple times so that it kind of lands and resonates with them and at different times in their life. But 16, I mean, I think, well, since she's in therapy, that's great. I'm glad to hear.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry for the loss that she's experienced, and I'm sure that takes a toll on you as well as her caregiver. So thank you for sharing that. I would say that I think I would default to the therapist if you trust the therapist, that if she feels that she knows kind of based off of the child's, temperament and personality and the things that she's sharing in session, that you should trust her guidance if you feel that she's someone that's, doing the right thing. And that maybe, little bits over time, addressing each one might be more helpful for her if you sense that she'd be overwhelmed by it all at once.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Brian? You have your hand up. Did you have a question?
Oh, somebody had a good suggestion, and that's something I use in my other. Hi, Katie. I wonder if you were on my childhood trauma webinar about trigger mapping. So this is a good idea for the 16-year-old, is to create a map with 4 seasons, like a circle map, and break it off into 4 quarters, and map throughout the year, throughout the seasons, when each loss occurred, and just prepare her that when each of these anniversaries come up, that, you know, she might be experiencing more overwhelm, or like you said, it kind of all happened at once. So giving her like some psychoeducation about grief and loss, and normalizing what she's going through, letting her know that she's not alone in these experiences, that when people grieve, it's typical to have, you know, educate yourself on like the different types of trauma responses that she might be having, and normalize all that for her. So, you know, grief and loss and trauma, they are normal reactions to abnormal events. They're not mentally ill, they're not sick. People that are traumatized or have grief and loss, this is a normal human experience to an abnormal event. So you want to help her to understand that there's nothing wrong with her. This is what our brains and bodies do when we're overwhelmed. I hope that's helpful. Thank you, Kayla.
And
Yes, thank you.
I think I can't find Brian. He had his hand up and I'm going through everyone and oh, there he is. Brian, do you still have a question or not? His hand is down now, so I'm assuming maybe not. Oh, Brian put his question in the chat, someone said. Okay, see if I can find it.
I found it. He's
Okay.
His granddaughter has started having nightmares. Do you think it's related to the loss of not having either of her biological parents around recently? It certainly could be. Again, you want to always rule out other issues with your family doctor. Your pediatrician is a great place to start. Letting them know about the loss is critical, and any other trauma that the child has experienced. But certainly nightmares are a symptom of ambiguous loss. Thank you for asking that, Brian. Okay, it looks like we're at 8:02. I don't see any hands up, and I guess that will conclude our session.
Anything else?
I would love to stay in touch with everybody. Again, please, before you hop off, just leave your email and we can stay in touch with one another that way. And also feel free to join us over in the Facebook group Emoda Minds. I hope to see you guys again.
Thank you, everyone. We appreciate everyone attending.
Yes, thank you guys all so much for having me tonight. I appreciate you being here.
Have a good night.
Good night, everyone. Deborah, can you stay on?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I think there's a way to save the chat so that we
Yeah. I think when it's recording, I think it may automatically save the chat. I'm not sure. I'm leaving that up to Catherine.
I know I found it before. Oh yeah, save chat.
It automatically saves the chat to me anyway. Did we stop the recording though? Let's stop the recording.
Oh, good idea. Thank you.